Margaret Stone had always found the sound of the wall clock soothing. But now, after 43 years of marriage, each tick echoed through the empty house like a hammer strike. 3 months had passed since James left, and the silence between clock beats grew heavier with each passing day. She sat at the kitchen table, mechanically stirring her long cold coffee. The April sun had finally broken through the clouds, flooding the kitchen with light through the large window that overlooked the backyard. From here, she could see the fence that separated her property from the Andersons' ranch next door. A massive bay horse, which she often saw, grazed near the fence, his sleek coat gleaming in the sunlight. "I should finally pack up his things," Margaret whispered to herself, but knew she wouldn't do it today either. Instead, she stood up, poured the cold coffee down the sink, and walked to the window. The horse raised his head as if sensing her gaze. This was Atlas. She had heard Sarah Anderson calling him by name. Majestic and calm, he seemed so incongruously lonely in the vast pasture. The telephone's ring shattered the silence, making Margaret jump. It was Sarah, their neighbor. "Margaret, sorry to bother you," Sarah's voice sounded worried. "We have a bit of an emergency. My father in Phoenix has been hospitalized, and Tom and I need to fly there immediately. We might need to stay for a few weeks." "Oh dear, I hope it's nothing serious. The doctors say he's stable. But you see, the thing is, our stable hand quit last week, and the new one can't start until next month. I know I'm asking a lot, but could you look after Atlas? Just check his water and feed him morning and evening. We pay you." Margaret wanted to refuse. She knew nothing about horses, except that they were large and could be dangerous. But something in Sarah's voice, desperation and hope intertwined, made her hesitate. I've never cared for horses," she replied honestly. "Oh, Atlas is very calm and well-behaved. You won't even need to enter his paddock. Just pour the feed into his trough through the fence and check the automatic water system. I'll show you everything. It's really simple." Margaret looked out the window. Atlas was still standing by the fence, his long mane gently swaying in the spring breeze. Something about his posture, the way he stood, lonely yet proud, reminded her of herself. "All right," the words escaped before she could think them through. "I'll help." After hanging up, Margaret felt her heart racing. What had she done? She knew nothing about horses. James always joked that she watered even the Christmas tree too cautiously, afraid of doing something wrong. And now she had agreed to care for an animal the size of a car? But when she looked out the window again and met Atlas's calm, dark eyes, something inside her settled. Maybe this was just another way to fill the void in her life. Or perhaps it was a sign that it was time for something to change. The clock on the wall continued counting seconds, but now its ticking seemed less oppressive. In an hour, Sarah would come to show her everything needed for the horse's care. Margaret looked at her hands, nervously clutching the cup. These same hands used to turn pages in the library, but would they manage caring for such a large animal? She stood up and walked to the mirror in the hallway, adjusting her gray hair, neatly gathered in a bun. The reflection showed a woman who had spent her whole life staying away from any risks. But something told her it was time for that to change. Precisely at 10 in the morning, Margaret heard a knock at the door. Sarah stood on the porch, dressed in jeans and an old cowboy jacket, her auburn hair tucked under a baseball cap with the local baseball team's logo. "Ready for your first lesson in horsemanship?" she smiled. And Margaret felt her nerves calm a bit at that worn smile. They crossed the yard and approached the stable. Sarah opened the door, to a small storage room and gestured for Margaret to enter. So, the feed is stored here, 2 scoops in the morning and 2 in the evening. The hay bales are stacked over there. 1 bale lasts 3 days. You just scatter it in the paddock. Margaret nodded, trying to memorize every detail. She pulled out the notebook she always carried with her, a habit from her days as a school librarian, and carefully wrote down the instructions. And these are his medications. Sarah pointed to a plastic box with several bottles. Atlas is 15 now, and he sometimes has joint problems. 1 scoop of this powder goes into his morning feed. 15? Is that old for a horse? Margaret asked, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. For some breeds, it's getting up there. But for a Clydesdale, he's not old yet. Just needs a bit more attention with age, like all of us. Sarah smiled gently. By the way, he loves apples. You can give him 1 or 2 a day as treats. Atlas watched them through the fence, his ears pointed forward with curiosity. Margaret glanced at the enormous horse. He stood almost 3 times taller than the fence, and felt her confidence waver. What if something goes wrong? She finally voiced her main concern. You have my phone number and our vet's number, but trust me, Atlas is the calmest horse I know. Tom jokes that he's more like a big dog than a horse. An hour later, Sarah and her husband left, leaving Margaret alone with her new responsibilities. She stood by the storage room, clutching the feed scoop in her hands, looking at Atlas. He had come closer to the fence, his large eyes seeming to look straight into her soul. Well, Margaret muttered, let's try to get acquainted. She carefully approached the feeding trough, trying not to make any sudden movements. Her hands trembled as she poured the feed. Atlas waited patiently until she finished before approaching the trough. There you go, she whispered, watching him eat. See, I can do this. After finishing with the feed, she tackled the hay. This proved to be a more challenging task. The bale was heavy, and she could barely lift it. After several unsuccessful attempts, she realized it would be easier to untie the bale and carry the hay in smaller armfuls. James would be laughing now, she said to herself, wiping sweat from her forehead. He always said I overcomplicate everything. Atlas raised his head from the feeding trough and looked at her, as if listening to her words. Margaret froze, struck by the expression in his eyes. There was some ancient wisdom there, a calm understanding she hadn't expected to see in an animal. You know, she said, surprising herself by talking to the horse, this is the first time I've said his name out loud since that day. Her voice trembled and broke off. Atlas took several steps in her direction and softly nickered, his warm breath creating small clouds in the cool spring air. Margaret reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out an apple she had brought from home. She held it out on an open palm, as Sarah had shown her. Atlas carefully took the fruit with his soft lips, not even touching her hand. Thank you, she whispered, and didn't know what she was thanking him for his gentleness, or his attentiveness, or for simply being there and listening. Walking back home in the twilight, Margaret felt something new, a small spark of warmth in her chest that hadn't been there in the morning. Perhaps for the first time in 3 months, she was looking forward to the next day. In her house, she went to the bookshelf and pulled out an old photo album. On one of the first pages was a photograph, she and James on horseback during their honeymoon in Montana. She had completely forgotten about this picture. Back then, she had been afraid to even approach the horse, but James had convinced her, saying that sometimes you need to do the things that scare you. Maybe you were right as always, dear, she whispered, running her finger over the photograph. This time, the memories didn't bring the usual pain. Instead, she felt something like gratitude for him teaching her to be braver, even if she was only now starting to apply that lesson. The photograph in the album had transported Margaret back in time, but the sudden sound of the alarm clock pulled her back to reality. 5:30 in the morning. She had never been an early bird, but now she had a reason to rise with the sun. Throwing on a warm robe, she walked to the window. In the early dawn, Atlas's silhouette was already visible by the fence. He always waited for his breakfast at the same time. "Good morning, friend," she whispered, and this simple phrase brought a slight smile. Just a week ago, she would never have thought she'd be calling a horse her friend. Dressed in jeans and James's old jacket, which had proved surprisingly practical for stable work, Margaret stepped outside. The morning air was fresh and clean after the night's rain. Her boots left marks in the damp earth as she walked to the stable. Atlas greeted her with a soft whinny. Over the past week, they had developed their own ritual. First, she would pour the feed, adding the necessary joint supplements. Then, while he ate, she would spread fresh hay. And finally, she would give him an apple, which he would carefully take from her palm. "You know," she said, watching him eat, "I've noticed I've started talking to you more than to people. I suppose that's a bit strange." Atlas raised his head and looked at her with his intelligent eyes, as if saying there was nothing strange about it. He always did that, looked directly at her when she spoke, as if he truly listened and understood. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to movement near the fence. A small rabbit slipped under the bottom rail and froze in the middle of the paddock. Atlas noticed it too, but instead of frightening it away, he just continued eating calmly, as if inviting the tiny guest to share his breakfast. "You're very kind, you know that?" Margaret said, watching this scene. So big and strong, but so gentle. She remembered how James always protected the spiders she wanted to remove from the house. "They're not bothering anyone, dear," he would say, "and they have their place in this world too." Perhaps Atlas reminded her of James somehow, that same quiet kindness she had loved so much in her husband. After finishing the morning chores, Margaret didn't rush to return home. Instead, she sat on the old wooden chair she had brought from home to the stable a few days ago. The morning sun slowly rose above the horizon, painting the sky in soft pink and gold colors. Atlas grazed nearby, his mighty figure against the dawn sky, creating an almost magical picture. The phone in her pocket vibrated. A message from her daughter. "How are you, Mom? Should I come visit this weekend?" Margaret looked at the screen, considering her response. Earlier, she would have agreed immediately. Any chance not to be alone had seemed like a lifeline. But now, "I'm doing well, honey," she typed. "I found a new hobby. I'll tell you about it when we meet." Putting the phone back in her pocket, she noticed that Atlas had come closer and now stood almost beside her, his large head looming over the fence. She slowly stood up and approached him. For the first time all week, she dared to reach out and touch his neck. His coat was warm and soft under her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, and this time she knew exactly what she was thanking him for helping her find something new in life when she least expected it. A sudden gust of wind brought the smell of rain. Margaret looked at the sky. Dark clouds were rolling in from the west. "Looks like we're in for an interesting day," she said, remembering Sarah's warning about horses being restless in rainy weather. But somehow, that thought no longer frightened her. She was beginning to understand that each day brings its own challenges, and the point wasn't to avoid them, but to meet them with an open heart. The first heavy raindrops fell as Margaret was finishing up in the stable. She was just closing the storage room door when a sharp gust of wind made her shudder. Atlas shifted uneasily from foot to foot, his ears perked up alertly. "Everything will be fine," she said, reassuring herself more than him. But no sooner had these words left her lips than a bright flash of lightning split the sky, followed almost instantly by a crack of thunder. Atlas jerked away from the fence, his powerful body tensing. Margaret had never seen him like this. The usually calm and majestic horse now seemed frightened, almost like a child. Another lightning bolt illuminated the sky, and this time Atlas whinnied loudly, beginning to pace nervously around the paddock. Margaret grabbed her phone with trembling hands and dialed Sarah's number. After several long rings, it went to voicemail. She tried again with the same result. The rain was now pouring down, turning the paddock ground into slippery muck. "Think, Margaret, think," she whispered, trying to remember everything Sarah had told her. Something about horses calming down in the stable during storms. But to get him there, she would need to enter the paddock. The very thought made her tremble. Thunder rumbled again, this time so close she felt the vibration in her chest. Atlas whinnied again, and in his voice she heard something that made her heart clench. Pure, unconcealed fear. The same fear she felt every night after James's death, when she would wake up screaming in an empty house. Before she could even process what she was doing, Margaret opened the gate and entered the paddock. The rain instantly soaked her to the skin, but she paid no attention. Her gaze was fixed on Atlas, who continued to move nervously in circles. "Hey, friend," she called out, trying to make her voice sound calm and confident, like Sarah's. "It's okay, I'm here." Atlas stopped and turned his head toward her. His eyes, wide with fear, met her gaze. She slowly began approaching him, her hand extended. "You know, I'm afraid too," she spoke as she continued to walk slowly. "Every day I wake up afraid that I won't be able to go on without him. But then I come to you, and it gets a little easier." Another clap of thunder made them both flinch, but this time Atlas didn't bolt. He stood still, watching her. Margaret came closer, her hands still extended. "We can be afraid together," she whispered, "and we can be brave together." Atlas took a step forward and gently touched her palm with his velvet muzzle. This simple gesture of trust made her eyes fill with tears that mixed with the raindrops on her face. Very slowly, step by step, she led him to the stable. He walked beside her, occasionally trembling at the thunder, but not trying to run away. When they finally made it inside, Margaret closed the gates and turned on the light. Atlas was still shaking, but not as severely. She found an old blanket and began drying his wet coat, softly humming, the same lullaby she used to comfort her daughter on stormy nights. Gradually, his breathing became steadier, his muscles relaxed. "See?" she said, running her hand along his mane. "We made it!" The storm still raged outside, but here in the warm stable, under the soothing patter of rain on the roof, fear seemed distant and insignificant. Margaret sat down on the straw next to Atlas, and he lowered his great head, as if shielding her from the rest of the world. In that moment, she realized she no longer felt alone. Perhaps life had prepared this unexpected gift for her, the chance to protect someone again and be protected in return. And although it wasn't what she had expected, maybe it was exactly what she needed. The morning after the storm, the air was remarkably clean and fresh. Margaret woke before her alarm, feeling an unusual lightness in her body. Last evening seemed almost unreal. How had she, always cautious and timid Margaret Stone, walked into a paddock during a storm to a frightened horse weighing a ton? She smiled, remembering how she had fallen asleep in the stable, leaning against Atlas's warm side. She had woken up at home, in her bed, must have walked there herself. Not even remembering it in her half-sleep. Putting on her jacket, she stepped outside. The morning sun sparkled on dewdrops, turning each blade of grass into a tiny prism. Atlas stood by the fence as always, but something had changed in his posture. When she approached, he stretched his neck over the fence, gently touching her shoulder. "Good morning, brave friend," she whispered, stroking his face. The fear she had felt before was completely gone, replaced by deep trust. While she was preparing his breakfast, the phone rang. It was Sarah. "Margaret, finally got through. I'm so sorry I couldn't answer yesterday. The reception here at the hospital is terrible. I saw there was a storm. How did you manage?" "Everything's fine," Margaret replied, surprising herself with her calm tone. "Atlas and we found common ground." "Really? He gets so anxious during storms. Are you sure everything's all right?" "Absolutely. You know, he helped me as much as I helped him." After ending the call, Margaret noticed the neighbor's girl, Lucy, approaching the stable. She had often seen her watching Atlas through the fence, but always keeping her distance. "Good morning, Lucy," Margaret greeted her. "Would you like to meet Atlas properly?" The girl nodded shyly, clutching a worn sketchbook. I love drawing horses," she mumbled, "but I've never seen them this close." Margaret remembered herself a week ago. The same fear, the same fascination. "You know, he's very kind, and he loves apples. I happen to have an extra one." The next half hour, she watched as the girl gradually gained courage, extending an apple on her trembling palm. Atlas seemed to understand the situation. He stood absolutely still, gently took the treat, and patiently waited while the young artist made sketches in her notebook. "Mrs. Stone," Lucy suddenly asked, not looking up from her drawing, "could you teach me about taking care of horses? I want to be a veterinarian when I grow up." Margaret felt something warm spread in her chest. A week ago, she would have immediately refused, saying she knew nothing about horses. But now, "You know what? Let's try. You can come in the mornings before school if your parents allow it. We'll learn together." The girl's eyes lit up, and she rushed to hug Margaret. Thank you. I'll ask my mom right now." When Lucy ran home, Margaret turned back to Atlas. "Well, looks like we've made a new friend," she said, and could have sworn she saw a spark of understanding in his eyes. Walking back to the house, she noticed that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about the emptiness inside. Instead, her thoughts were occupied with plans for the future. She needed to find books about horses at the library, maybe even sign up for some courses, and perhaps it was time to sort out James's study, not to erase his memory, but to make space for something new. Life, it turned out, didn't end with loss. It just found new paths, new connections, new meanings. She stopped at the mailbox and took out an envelope. It was a letter from her daughter. She still sent paper letters, knowing how much her mom loved receiving them. Margaret opened the envelope right there on the path to the house and began to read. In the letter, her daughter expressed concerns about her mom, suggesting that perhaps it was time to sell the house and move closer to her and her husband. Margaret looked at Atlas, who still stood by the fence, majestically silhouetted against the morning sky. For the first time in a long while, she knew exactly what she would reply. Sometimes home isn't about walls, but about a sense of belonging. And sometimes, the most unexpected creatures can teach us the most important life lessons. Lucy kept her word. The next morning, at exactly 6 o'clock, she was standing at Margaret's gate, dressed in old overalls and rubber boots, her hair carefully braided in 2 plaits. In her hands, she held a new notebook and several apples. "I asked Mom to buy special apples for Atlas," the girl announced proudly. "The store clerk said these are the sweetest." Margaret smiled, remembering her first week with Atlas and how she too had sorted through apples at the store, trying to pick the best ones. "Come on," she said, opening the gate. "But remember, work first, treats after." They walked to the stable together, and Margaret began explaining all the morning procedures. Lucy carefully wrote down every word in her notebook, occasionally adding small sketches in the margins. 2 scoops of oats, 1 measure of joint supplement, Margaret dictated, showing how to measure the feed correctly. And most importantly, do everything in the same order, so Atlas knows what to expect. "Like my cat," Lucy exclaimed. "She likes everything to happen on schedule too." Exactly. All animals love predictability. It gives them a sense of security. While they worked, Atlas watched them with his attentive gaze. When Lucy approached the feeding trough with a scoop of feed, he nickered softly, as if encouraging her. "He's so smart," the girl whispered in awe. "Do you think, Mrs. Stone, he understands everything we say?" Margaret thought for a moment. "You know, I think animals understand much more than we give them credit for. They just communicate differently." "How?" "Well, look at his ears. See how they're turned toward us? That means he's listening carefully. And when he lowers his head and half closes his eyes, that's a sign he's relaxed and trusts us." Lucy pulled out her notebook and started quickly sketching Atlas's different ear positions. "Like body language?" she asked, not looking up from her drawing. "Exactly. And you know what? When I first started caring for him, he taught me a very important thing. Sometimes you just need to be present. Not talking, not doing anything special, just being there." The girl nodded with a serious expression. "Like when Mom was sick last year, and I just sat with her and held her hand?" Margaret felt her heart clench at this simple wisdom. "Exactly like that, dear. Exactly like that." They finished the morning chores, and Lucy finally took out the apples. Margaret showed her how to hold her palm properly, flat and steady. "Aren't you afraid?" Lucy asked, watching Atlas take an apple from Margaret's hand. "You know, I was at first, but then I realized, when you trust, you get trust in return." "Like with friends?" "Exactly. And you know what? Sometimes the best friends appear where you least expect them." Lucy extended her small hand with an apple, and Atlas took it just as carefully, not even touching her skin. The girl's eyes lit up with delight. "Mrs. Stone," she said as they were putting away the equipment, "can I come every day? I won't be in the way, I promise. And I want to learn everything about horses." Margaret looked at her watch. There was still plenty of time before school started. "You know what? Let's do this. You come in the morning, we take care of Atlas together, and then I'll walk you to school. I can pick up some horse books from the library while I'm there. What do you say?" "Really? And you'll teach me everything you know?" "We'll learn together," Margaret replied, suddenly realizing how true that was. "And you know what? I think Atlas will be happy to have another friend." Later that day, sitting in her favorite armchair with a cup of tea, Margaret looked at James's photo on the mantelpiece. "You'd be proud of me, dear," she whispered. "I'm finally doing what you always talked about, opening my heart to new possibilities." And for the first time in a long while, there was no pain in these words, only quiet gratitude for everything that had been, and peaceful anticipation of what was yet to come. 3 weeks flew by like a single day. The morning meetings with Lucy had become as important a part of Margaret's day as caring for Atlas. She noticed that the girls started coming earlier and earlier, eager to spend more time with the horse. Her notebook gradually filled, not only with drawings, but also with notes about feed, care, and horse behavior. That morning, Lucy arrived especially early, holding something wrapped in paper. "Mrs. Stone, I drew something for you." Unwrapping the paper, Margaret froze in amazement. On the sheet was a masterfully executed pencil drawing, herself standing next to Atlas, one hand on his neck, the other holding an apple. But what struck her most was how accurately the young artist had captured her expression, peaceful and content. "Lucy, this is beautiful," Margaret whispered, feeling something warm gathering in the corners of her eyes. "You're smiling here," the girl explained. "Like now." "You didn't smile much before." Before Margaret could respond, a car pulled into the yard. It was Sarah and Tom, who had returned earlier than planned. Seeing Lucy with Margaret by the stable, Sarah raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Margaret? We didn't expect. I thought." "Good morning, Sarah," Margaret smiled softly. "Lucy and I were just about to give Atlas his breakfast. Would you like to join us?" Watching how confidently Lucy prepared the feed and how calmly Atlas accepted food from her small hands, Sarah looked impressed. "You taught her all this?" "We learned together," Margaret replied, watching the girl show Sarah her notebook with its detailed notes. "Lucy wants to become a veterinarian, and Mrs. Stone is helping me learn everything about horses," Lucy added enthusiastically. "We even went to the library and got special books." Sarah looked from the girl to Margaret, then to Atlas, who had gently rested his head on his temporary caretaker's shoulder. "You know," she said after a pause, "Tom and I have been thinking about opening a small riding school for children at the ranch. But we'd need someone who could help with basic care and theory, someone who knows how to connect with both horses and children." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "Are you suggesting?" "It would only be a few hours a day," Sarah quickly added, "and of course, we'd pay." "I could help," Lucy exclaimed. "If Mrs. Stone agrees to teach other children." Margaret looked at Atlas, who watched the conversation with his wise gaze. Just a month ago, she would have immediately refused, saying she didn't have enough experience. But now, "You know what?" she said, feeling her lips curve into a smile. "Let's give it a try." That evening, sitting in her yard and watching the sun set on the horizon, Margaret took out the old photo album. This time, she wasn't looking for any particular photograph, just letting the memories flow freely. Here she was with James on their wedding day, her first day at the library, their daughter's birth. "Life is strange, isn't it?" she said aloud, knowing Atlas was listening from his paddock. "You never know which turn will lead you where you need to be." She thought about all the changes that had occurred over this month, about overcome fears, new connections, unexpected possibilities, about how loss can open doors to something new if you allow yourself not to be afraid. From the house came the ticking of the clock, but now it sounded different, not as a reminder of loneliness, but as the calm rhythm of life continuing. Margaret closed the album and looked at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. Thank you, Atlas, she whispered, for teaching me the most important thing. Sometimes you just need to open your heart and let life surprise you. A soft whinny came in response, and Margaret smiled. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new beginning, and she was ready to meet it with an open heart and peaceful soul, knowing that life's best turns often come at the most unexpected times and in the most unexpected forms.